Hi, welcome to today's class in politics and society. So last time we continued looking at kind of some of the top-down sources of our kind of political knowledge, political views, and our ideology. And so we had looked at kind of the mass media. This time we're going to continue and with the media, but we're going to shift to a couple of newer media trends, so social media and soft media. All right, so let's start with social media. So social media is playing a growing role in politics, and it has produced certain advantages and disadvantages. So like most changes in technology, there's always, there's often certain perks that we're going to find, but also certain pitfalls. And so it's kind of a challenge for society to figure out how to navigate them. Um, so let's start with some of the advantages. So politicians have greater access to the public, and the public has greater access to politicians, right? So a lot of uh, politicians have a lot of following on social media. It's easy for someone who's not even necessarily super interested in politics to just follow a politician and get some updates. There's also kind of more direct line of communications from the politician directly to the public, so it's not filtered through the media prism. Uh, right, so normally the media has kind of a gatekeeping function where they can choose what they cover and what they don't cover. But when it comes to social media, the politician can speak directly to the public, even on issues that the media normally wouldn't cover. It also means that they can get their message out devoid of kind of the media framing. So if someone still watches the mass media, they would see some framing on potentially on how this information um, is kind of interpreted, but at least the politician gets a direct statement out to potentially out to the public. And there are a lot of followers for many of these politicians. So these numbers are about 2 years old. So some may have gone up somewhat and some may have gone down. So we start with Barack Obama having 102 million followers. And so just as a kind of comparison, Kim Kardashian, who at the time wasn't really political, now she's kind of shifted a little bit in terms of running some of her own kind of political campaigns on criminal justice, but also with her husband's campaign. So comparatively, Barack Obama has more than 40 million, at least at the time, followers compared to Kim Kardashian. Donald Trump's numbers would have gone up quite considerably in the last couple of years, but at the time he was at 54.5 million. Hillary Clinton at 23.4, Justin Trudeau at 4.3, Chrystia Freeland. So her numbers certainly would have gone up with COVID and her promotion, and just during COVID being on TV a lot more, but Chrystia Freeland at the time was at 104,000. So your normal cabinet minister, you're not thinking is when they put out a press release, from their department, say you're at Foreign Affairs and you're putting out a press statement, it's not usually going to be seen by 104,000 people, but she had 104,000 followers. And then Foreign Policy Canada's account, so just the government agencies, account had 94.2 thousand. So again, these numbers are a couple of years old. Some would have probably gone up drastically. Some may have gone down somewhat. But it's to show that many of these politicians have a sizable direct reach right through their social media. And so that is an advantage in terms of the possibility of direct communication. Also potentially even of, if you follow someone and you can tweet at them, say on Twitter. And so these would have been Twitter followers. You could tweet right at them and potentially get a response or get a response from someone in their circle. So some disadvantages. So if we're taking Twitter, which is kind of the dominant social media site for politicians communicating directly with people, messages restricted to at a time 140 and now 280 characters can be misleading, right? So if you're dealing with a complex issue and you're restricted to quite a few characters, you're either going to have a long chain of tweets, or you're going to have to simplify the issue dramatically. And so that can lead to misleading statements. Source of information is often uncertain. So in certain cases, it could be directly on the tweet, right? It's from the, say, president's account or prime minister's account, but we don't actually know if it was a president or prime minister who wrote it. It could have been a staffer. But more, in this case, source of information is often uncertain, is that some politicians have gotten in trouble for retweeting messages from hate groups, right? So they're going through the internet and they see a tweet that, you know, is supporting of their policies or putting out a message that they're sympathetic with. They see the message. They don't necessarily look at the source. Who is the source who's saying it? Is the information accurate? But also more so is, you know, what are the other views that you're putting out? Because in many eyes, retweeting is also kind of a tacit, not just support for the message, but also for the messenger or for the source. And so if you're retweeting, for example, you know, a message from a white supremacist, this could be, and this, you know, has happened several times, this can cause public relations kind of nightmares. Unplanned and heat of the moment messages. One of the advantages of kind of press releases, press statements, press conferences is that you get a little bit more time to plan out your messaging. Whereas when you're, you know, on Twitter, all you need to do is, if you're really angry, all you need to do is pick up your phone, type out the tweet, and hit send. And politicians, just like any of us, you know, can sometimes get upset and put out messages that they may later regret. I'm sure many of you who use social media may have posted something, or even not necessarily social media. Maybe some of you in the past have sent a text message that after sending in the heat of the moment, once you kind of reflect on it, you may have regretted. Well, that's the same for politicians, but these can have a lot greater impact. Moving away from standard policy and or diplomatic processes. This isn't necessarily bad, but it does upset kind of the order. There was a kind of an understood way of doing, for example, things like foreign policy, or for communicating between different organizations within the country, so between opposition and government, right? And this kind of moves away from those channels, and which can lead to misunderstandings and to lack of clarity about what the stance is. So for example, imagine that you're a Canadian diplomat dealing with the United States, and the US ambassador you're a Canadian government official dealing, frequently with the US, and you speak to the US ambassador and they tell you one thing, and then the president tweets a completely different thing, right? And the usual channel for getting your information would be through the US ambassador. And so but you then go to conflict where his boss or her boss is saying something different. And so which message is government policy? Which message are you supposed to go on as being the true statement of relations between the two countries? And so that can lead to problems. And then you also just have the issue of, on social media, you have a lot of trolls who are just trying to rile up dissent, and can actually help to further polarize, and bots who can be doing similar things. There's also what we've seen kind of in the last election, where there's a lot of talking about kind of, Russian meddling, and a lot was through social media. And that's not just occurring in the States. There's a lot of evidence that happens in many different countries, and not necessarily just from Russia. It could be other countries or other organizations that are meddling by putting out false messages, just attempting to kind of rile up certain segments of the electorate, so spreading false messages or misleading messages. And so that's something that you have in social media that you didn't have to the same extent in print media or televised news or stuff like that. So let's take a look at a few different kind of social media posts that where we could look at, what are the advantages and disadvantages. So here's one to look at that has certainly some advantages and some disadvantages that end up leading to a dispute between Canada and Saudi Arabia. So this was a tweet put out by a government cabinet minister, whose job is foreign relations, and She put out the tweet, very alarmed to learn that Samar Badawi, Raif Badawi's sister, has been imprisoned in Saudi Arabia. Canada stands together with the Badawi family in this difficult time, and we continue to strongly call for the release of both Raif and Samar. So um, the advantage here, right? So when she put out this tweet, it said she, if a Canadian foreign policy priority is human rights, and particularly when it, relates to particular cases that strike close to home, say potentially involving Canadian citizens. So if this is a government priority, by putting out a tweet, you're actually reaching many, many, many more people than you otherwise would if, Foreign Policy or Foreign Affairs Canada had just put out, a press release on it. Some in the mass media might have reported on it, depending on gatekeeping, and some, people who have a lot of interest in politics might have seen it. But many of those people probably were already aware of the case and would already be sympathetic with the view. So you're not going to be changing too many minds with it. It's not going to have much reach. So by putting it out on Twitter, you're potentially also activating a lot of different people in the public to be caring about this and to be spreading it across the internet and potentially putting a different form of pressure on Saudi Arabia. So not even necessarily direct government pressure, but also indirect kind of civil society pressure. And so that could be a really effective new tool for doing foreign policy. The downside too, though, is, again, it's a small statement. It's going outside of normal diplomatic channels. So normal diplomatic channels would be, direct communication, say, from the cabinet minister to their counterparts in say, the Saudi government. You also have potential for embarrassment in Saudi Arabia and different reaction. So from Saudi Arabia's perspective, this was kind of public shaming and was outside of normal diplomatic procedure, and it was Canada getting involved in internal Saudi business. And so it's hard to know whether, in terms of, say, filing complaints with another government, is Twitter your ideal forum for doing so. So there's potential misunderstandings, or also by having the issue become, more widespread, more likelihood that the other side is going to have to respond. And so in this case, it produced diplomatic tensions between Canada and Saudi Arabia, including expulsion of diplomats, freezing of trade, and recalling of students. It also involved many citizens and bots in Saudi Arabia targeting Canadian officials and academics. So there was a lot, like if you were a Canadian academic or government worker who was in kind of discussing the Middle East at all, the number of comments you were getting, and so I wasn't personally tweeting on it, but I knew some of the people I follow were, and some of the attacks were quite vicious. Some were also rightfully calling out, darker times in Canadian or Canadian human rights, saying Canada shouldn't be shaming them when our house isn't completely in order. Although I've always found those attacks, miss the point. No one's ever going to be perfect, but that's for a different topic. And so while there were some healthy debates on social media, many posts and replies had questionable and sometimes outright fabricated facts. And so, yes, it definitely increased the visibility of the issue. And in fact, it became because of the response, became actually a fairly big news story. So you went from something that if Chrystia Freeland had just put out, a kind of a press release, would have gotten very little attention, to something that became a major debate. So in that sense, it highly politicized the issue, but it also had some negative repercussions. And then some of the replies definitely had questionable or fabricated facts. And Saudi Arabia then had some issues on some of the messages put out that got either directly sent by accounts with government ties, or were retweeted by accounts with government ties, or outright by government agencies, that led them into problems, right? So in terms of their response, rather than just a statement, started retweeting, and that's where we can get into the questionable sources. Where's the source? Or in some cases, the message? How is the message to be interpreted? Heat of the moment retweeting can lead to problems. And this was one image that produced a lot of controversy, and that some of the agencies that retweeted it related to the government kind of had to apologize or explain. In this one, the statement says, as the Arabic saying goes, he who interferes with what doesn't concern him finds what doesn't please him. And so Saudi Arabia, Canada. Now, where the controversy came isn't with the statement, it's with the image. A plane flying towards the CN Tower. Now, according to the statement, what the image was meant to convey was the Canadian diplomats being expelled and being sent home. Why they are being sent to Toronto as opposed to Ottawa, one doesn't know, but I suppose when you're producing kind of images for Twitter, accuracy is not that important. But what everyone saw, nobody saw that message. What everyone saw was a plane flying towards a building, or in this case, a tower, in a major city. And the imagery was very reminiscent of 9/11. And so this image was interpreted as a threat. And when you have government agencies or those tied to government agencies retweeting it or posting it, that was a problem. And so there's debate kind of on both sides about were there advantages and disadvantages in a lot of the in how social media helped advance political goals. The next we're going to look at some tweets from Donald Trump. This isn't to attack or support Donald Trump. Most of the tweets we're going to, or all the tweets I'm going to show, are ones that potentially one would call into question as perhaps not being wise. This isn't to call out Donald Trump as good or bad. It's more, the reason I've chosen Donald Trump tweets is that he's kind of one of the first, at least major politicians, to not just use Twitter a lot, but also to be using Twitter for not just like kind of communications or advertising, but even making policy, right? Where even the courts have found that, Twitter for Donald Trump is a policy announcing venue or site, as opposed to kind of your normal routes where policy is announced. He makes policy announcements through Twitter. And so it took Twitter to a step further, social media to a step further than other politicians. So here we have, one directed at Iran: never ever threaten the United States again, or you'll suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. We are no longer a country that will stand for your demented words of violence and death. Be cautious. So other than the constant caps lock of yelling, I guess it's conveying anger quite effectively. And it's definitely a clear message of displeasure, right? But first, in terms of communicating effectively your policy stance to another country, is this the language and venue that is the most conducive to having clear communications and avoiding escalations? It's unclear that social media would be the ideal venue for doing so. Moreover, kind of the language use here, and this is perhaps, another leader may be able to do this more effectively, but the language use here doesn't give the sense of kind of a coherent, thought out policy. And so, what if a direct statement or phone call between ambassadors or between, foreign minister and ambassador or foreign ministers have been a more effective way of communicating, or even between leaders themselves, a more effective way of communicating and de-escalating? Probably. Okay, so related to more directly to Canada. So this was after Canada hosted the G7 meeting. So PM Justin Trudeau of Canada acted so meek and mild during our G7 meetings, only to give a news conference after I left saying that US tariffs were kind of insulting and it will not be pushed around. Very dishonest and weak. Our tariffs are in response to his 270% on dairy. based on Justin's false statements at his news conference and the fact that Canada is charging massive tariffs to our US farmers, workers, and companies, I've instructed our US reps not to endorse the communique as we look at tariffs on automobiles flooding the US market. So this kind of looks a little bit like a heat of the moment type one, where you had kind of, he saw the press conference after he left, wasn't particularly pleased with, something that was said in it, about we won't be standing for the US tariff. I mean, the Canadian leader, if he's directly asked at a press conference about US tariffs, it's not surprising he's not going to be supportive of them, right? So was this this looks kind of like a heat of the moment, calling of names is probably not the best way to be resolving very dishonest and weak isn't kind of your best way to be solving an issue or de-escalating an issue. So this kind of looks like a heat of the moment type tweet that didn't really, I don't think any interpretation of it could view it as advancing US policy or US interests. And so here's kind of your heat of the moment where I'm not sure this necessarily helped. Here's one of kind of making policy and whether this is the best way of making policy. So I hereby demand, and we'll do so officially tomorrow, that the Department of Justice look into whether or not FBI, Department of Justice, infiltrated or surveilled the Trump campaign for political purposes, if any such demands or requests were made by people within the Obama administration. So, I mean, he can direct investigations or he is, so he could probably ask the Department of Justice to look into it. I'm not a legal scholar as to whether he's allowed, where the kind of lines are for what he can direct the Department of Justice to do. But if you're going to be directing the Department of Justice to do so, probably the first thing to do is direct the Department of Justice to do so. After you've done, after it's already started, and if you want to be announcing it on Twitter that this investigation has started, or that's one thing. But doing it before the Department of Justice, having the kind of the first place the FBI or DOJ hears about it is on Twitter, isn't the best case. There's also some of where it announced kind of different changes in policies in the military about who could serve, or kind of policies related to soldiers. And the first place it was announced was on Twitter. And then all the calls were going to the Department of Defense being like, so what are you going to be doing to implementing this policy? And they say, we don't know. We haven't seen, all we've seen is the tweet. We haven't seen a policy, right? And so they're kind of caught in that in a certain sense, given that these are government statements in a way, they're being directed to do something without knowing exactly what, how, when, why, and stuff like that. And then finally, another kind of foreign policy one that shows that is Twitter the best avenue for making policy. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un just stated that the nuclear button is on his desk at all times. With someone from his depleted and food-starved regime, please inform him that I too have a nuclear button, but it's a much bigger and more powerful one than his, and my button works, right? And so when you're making foreign policy by comparing the size of nuclear buttons, A, that's a little bit scary, but B, is this helping at all with the issue? Is this kind of the form of government communication that you want? Now, this wasn't the only communication that there existed between the two leaders. There would have been some between lower level officials. They were writing each other letters and stuff like that. But does this help de-escalate at all? Is this good government policy making? And that's more questionable. All right, so social media, selective exposure or diversity. So it's a question about the debate about, how much is social media changing the political discourse. And so there's a debate between positions on exposure to more diverse ideas leads to a more robust and pluralistic debate. So you could be following politicians and people with a whole bunch of different ideas. And by being exposed to more different ideas, you could have a a better and more honest debate. So there is that possibility, although if you've ever watched or looked at debates and comments on social media, it's can be hard to see how it's a more robust debate. But I mean, in theory, you could be following politicians from different sides, seeing tweets about different issues presented in different ways, and in that sense, by being exposed to more different viewpoints, which is something that usually helps create more tolerance and more kind of centrist views, less extreme views. I mean, social media can serve that purpose. On the flip side, selective exposure to ideologically congruent messages lead to more extremism and polarization, right? So social media also allows you to get more politics more of the time, right? Another source where politics could be coming in, and you get to choose who you follow, right? And so you could just follow people who are going to be saying the exact same things that you already believe and not following anyone who says the opposing. So if you're, say, a liberal, you could just follow liberals and just see what members of the Liberal Party tweet out, or supporters of the Liberal Party tweet out, and never look at a single tweet by a conservative, other than if it's being mocked when they say something bad, right? And everybody once in a while says something that they'll regret. So in every party, there could be tweets that a member of the party, that can get retweeted to show, hey, look how terrible they are, right? So all you could be exposed to is retweets of things that the other side said that they probably regret, and good things that your side says, and really actually end up with more extreme and polarized views. So we're going to look a little bit at kind of the study that you were reading about. So go a little bit in detail on it, because I know it was a little bit more complicated of an article. So possible hypotheses. So polarization exists for political issues, but not for other current events and issues, right? So we are polarized in terms of so if you're a liberal, you only follow liberal politicians. But when it comes to celebrities or friends or athletes or stuff like that, when it's on non-political things like movies, you just follow anybody. You don't even care what their political leaning is. You don't look at their political leaning. You follow them because you're a fan, for example, or you follow your friends because you're friends. And so when you're looking at kind of non-political issues, you just you follow anyone. It's just polarization in messaging and opinion when it comes to political issues. Another possible hypothesis: due to psychological need to maintain our identities and reduce cognitive dissonance, both liberals and conservatives are equally likely to select information that confirms their worldview, right? So everybody wants to maintain their identity and avoid kind of unpleasant thoughts. And so you could say that members of both political kind of everybody on the ideological spectrum, on both sides of the ideological spectrum, are more likely to have selective exposure to views that already fit with their own. And a third hypothesis: due to their psychological need to reduce uncertainty, threat, and social disorder, conservatives would be more likely to select information that confirms their worldview. So liberals may still have selective exposure, but conservative, because they have a greater need to avoid uncertainty, threat, or social disorder, are the ones who would be more likely for selective exposure. So just kind of a statement on kind of how they went about measuring this. It's not too important for your purposes, but it's kind of when we getting into social media, a lot of our usual measures are a little bit more problematic. Because in particular for Twitter, many Twitter users don't identify their ideology on their profiles. So it could be difficult to measure selective exposure with social media, right? So not everybody writes, I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm an NDP voter, I'm a conservative voter, I'm a bloc voter, right? So what they used was a model that assumes that if individuals are embedded in networks that are homogenous with regards to social, demographic, and behavioral characteristics, then their connections can be interpreted as indications of similarity. There's reason to believe that social networks are indeed homophilous when it comes to political ideology, right? So people who are likely to be in networks of people who think like them. So if you look at their network, you can figure out kind of where they stand. And so we can get an idea of kind of the views of the person by looking at their network, right? So here's kind of a graph for showing that. So citizens with liberal opinions kind of uh, on the right axis, and ideology of medium Twitter user. And so it's kind of showing that these actually go along, right? So using their method actually seems to fit with kind of the statewide data, right? So if we look at kind of user method for predicting Twitter users, we end up with numbers that pretty much correlate with the percentage of citizens who hold liberal opinions based on kind of public opinion surveys and stuff like that. So it seems to be that their method seems to work. So here's kind of issues that they used for measuring selective exposure. So the issues examined, and how many tweets there were about these different issues. So some of them are political issues, some of them aren't political issues. So you've got, like, for example, the 2012 presidential campaign, but you also have the Winter Olympics. Not as much of a political, or the Oscars or Super Bowl, although Oscars arguably are becoming more of a political issue. At the time, it would have been less so. And even now, I think most people would still say that's an entertainment, not a political issue. So we'll kind of look at tweet collections in 12 different categories. And so they used 3 different ways of measuring polarization: the percentage of retweets that took place among individuals who were ideologically similar, the degree of ideological homogeneity in communities of users detected in the retweet networks, and the average ideological extremity of the content that was spread via retweets. And we'll look at some of those. And I think looking kind of at the graph will make it more apparent. So let's just go right over to the graph, and I think that will help potentially understand a little more what they're doing, right? So here, what we're seeing so on the kind of the vertical axis, we've got kind of the estimated ideology of the retweeter, so the person who's retweeting a message. And then we've got the estimated on the horizontal axis, we've got the estimated ideology of the author, right? So if you see, for example, on many of them, like, for example, 2012 election, right? If the people who retweeted, say, if we say here's liberal, on the right side is liberal, people who retweeted tweets that were posted by kind of liberal authors tended to be liberal, and people who retweeted conservative messages tended to be conservative. And there was very little overlap. You didn't see liberals retweeting conservative. You didn't see, you didn't see liberals retweeting conservative. You didn't see conservatives retweeting liberals. Same thing on many of them. You get some level of kind of the middle is retweeting everyone to a certain extent. But again, on budget, liberals are retweeting liberals, conservatives are retweeting conservatives. Government shutdown, liberals are retweeting liberals, conservatives retweeting conservatives. And so on all of these political issues, you get a very similar pattern where it seems to be selective exposure, or at minimum selective retweeting. We don't actually know who all the people who are retweeting are following, so they may be exposed to different messages. So, for example, you could be a Republican in the U.S. and follow Barack Obama or Joe Biden. You could be a Democrat in the U.S. and follow Donald Trump, right? But this is showing retweeting, at least the message that you're spreading to your network, and you're much more likely to spread a message if it comes from somebody you agree with than somebody you disagree with. And so there does seem to be some polarization or selective exposure when it comes to political issues. Now let's look at non-political issues. So the Boston Marathon bombing, the Newton shooting, 2014 Oscars, Super Bowl, Syria, and Winter Olympics. So on some of them, so for example, the Super Bowl, which is clearly almost completely non-political, the Winter Olympics, almost completely non-political, right? There's politics doesn't seem to really come into it. It does. If you're liberal, you're perfectly fine retweeting someone who's conservative. If you're conservative, you're perfectly fine retweeting someone who's liberal. There's the slightly more political, and same thing with the 2014 Oscars. So the three issues that are slightly more political of them, so the Boston Marathon bombing, the Newton shooting, and Syria, have elements where you do see more kind of cross-ideological retweeting, but you do have also some element of more polarization or more selective exposure. So it's a little bit of a mix. You're more likely than on other political issues to retweet cross-ideologically, but there is still some selective exposure. Now, who is more likely to be doing cross-ideological retweeting? And so this is showing estimated rate of cross-ideological retweeting. And so blue is liberal and red is conservative. And so on the top has the political issues, right? And on the political issues, we see first cross-ideological retweeting on most of them is quite low, right? You're not particularly likely to retweet someone who has a different viewpoint, an author has a different viewpoint than you. But there is also evidence in many of the different issues that liberals are more likely to do so. So remember, there was a hypothesis that said cross-ideological retweeting would be low. That seems to be supported on political issues. But we also have evidence that conservatives probably, and the hypothesis said because of kind of their fear of threat or uncertainty, would be less likely to do so. We also see that on non-political issues, there's cross-ideological retweeting is higher. So higher, more over here than over here. But also there's less difference between liberals and conservatives. The major difference being on the Oscars, apparently, which is interesting, where there was a fair amount of difference, and the Newton shooting. But on most of the other ones, they're quite close together. And so kind of in summary, on political issues, conservatives were less likely to engage in cross-ideology retweeting, which fit with their hypothesis, but there's also evidence that liberals were likely to do it. So, right, so there is evidence of, for everyone, kind of the desire for maintaining your identity and avoiding cognitive dissonance. So there does seem to be that everyone has some element on political issues of selective exposure, but it's stronger for conservatives. We do see cross-ideological retweeting was more common for non-political issues. So as they hypothesized, there's a difference between political issues and non-political issues. And the difference in polarization between liberals and conservatives is smaller for non-political issues. All right, so now let's turn to soft news. And so we'll start our talk of soft news with the Oprah Effect. And so politicians are increasingly appearing on soft news programs. And so what are soft news programs? So you've got two main kinds. So first, you've got the traditional, largely apolitical soft news talk programs, such as The View, Oprah, Late Show, and Tonight Show. Some of these over the years have become more and more political. So The View certainly does have political discussions. Some of the Late Show, or more and more of kind of even the late night general shows, are devoting, a greater percentage of their jokes to politics than they did in the past. So even your traditional, largely apolitical soft news shows have gone a little bit more political recently. But typically, their jokes and their opening monologues were, they may have some political jokes sometimes, but the vast majority of them were on whatever was in the news. It didn't have to be politics. And their guests were generally apolitical. But politicians sometimes did start appearing in them. Starting more in the 90s, you started seeing politicians appearing. And then you have satirical political comedy productions such as The Daily Show, the now defunct Colbert Report, and Last Week Tonight. And so these are, kind of soft news programs, but that are more explicitly political. So they're kind of, they could be satirical news shows or satirical kind of talk shows, depending on the case. But they're presenting the news, but in kind of a more, or politics, but in a more comedic fashion. And so we've seen the rise in prominence in both of these, and politicians are increasingly also appearing on them. So why would politicians appear on traditional soft news shows? So given that these shows, particularly on traditional ones. So why did they start appearing on shows that traditionally are quite apolitical? What's the game for them? So soft news programs offer larger audiences than news programs. So particularly as we saw fewer and fewer people watching the news because they had more options, if you wanted to be appealing to non-political people or people who aren't that interested in politics, appearing on the shows that they are watching gets your voice and your face out there more. Many soft news viewers are less politically engaged, ideologically extreme, or partisan, making them more easily persuadable. Right, so you're going on shows where many of the viewers don't care as much about politics, right? So they don't hold extreme views. People who hold extreme views are very hard to persuade to change their views. People who don't hold strong views can much more easily be persuaded to change their positions. And so it's kind of a fertile ground of people who are potentially persuadable and who otherwise, if may not show up, and you could potentially persuade them to show up for your side. And politicians are presented in a more relatable manner. So you can have, for example, Bill Clinton appearing on a soft news show playing his saxophone, right? When they appear on other news shows, all the questions they're typically getting are about politics, right? When they're appearing on a soft news show, they we'll probably get some political questions, but they're probably going to get some, just very humanizing questions. How's your family doing? What's it like adjusting to living in, a life, kind of always in the spotlight. And so they can come across more human than just as kind of politicians. And so that can be really advantageous, particularly for a politician who's having a likability issue. If they can go out on a soft news show and really come across as being very human, right? Very approachable, very likable, it can turn around some of their polling numbers. So the Oprah Effect, so it's kind of the soft news effect of appearing on traditional political shows, was referred to as the Oprah Effect due to kind of her centrality in traditional soft news. Was originally viewed as the influence of consuming soft news political content on vote choice. So originally the question was, does it affect kind of vote turnout and choice? But actually more recent research has suggested that there may be 4 components to how traditional soft news can have an impact. And so it may be attention to politics, knowledge about politics, political attitudes, and political behavior. And we'll look at each of them kind of in turn. So first, in terms of attention, basic attentiveness to political information is arguably the lowest threshold of learning of the 4 effects, right? So just having a little bit of attention to politics, isn't a terribly big threshold. But it is required if you want to have knowledge, understanding, and in all likelihood, action. You have to have people paying attention. So it's an important element for learning. So evidence from a variety of public opinion surveys suggesting that politically unengaged individuals who consume soft news are more attentive to major political events than their counterparts who do not consume soft news. Conversely, consuming soft news does not influence highly politically engaged individuals. So if you have, for example, politicians or people kind of seeing the political discussions on soft news programs or seeing politicians appear on them, they become more politically attentive than the people who aren't watching those soft news programs, if among the unengaged. So for example, say you have somebody who spends their time watching a soft news, so late night kind of comedy, late night talk shows, as opposed to somebody who watches sports. And both the viewers are politically unengaged. The one watching the soft news program is more likely to become politically engaged or politically attentive than the person watching, say, the sport programming. And the reason for doing so, why is it, if you still don't care about politics, why would you, start caring or paying attention? Well, it makes it more interesting and entertaining, right? You're not getting kind of the heavy dose of kind of news, the drier elements that you might be getting, say, on CNN of the political issues. You're getting it presented in a more digestible, fun, interesting way. You're getting a more humanized view of the politician. And you're like, oh, I like this person. Let's pay attention to what they're talking about. Type thing, as opposed to necessarily, switching over to massively caring about the issues or the minutia. It doesn't affect the politically engaged individuals, because politically engaged people are already paying attention, but also soft news isn't necessarily presenting politics in a way that would be as interesting in them. They care about, say, the policy positions and stuff like that. They don't necessarily care about, does the politician play a musical instrument? That's more on the kind of the lifestyle side, not the politics side, and they already care about the politics side. So political satire shows target politically attentive viewers. Traditional soft news shows target less politically attentive viewers, right? So they have different targets, the two different types of soft news programs. Political satire ones aren't going to be as big on attention because they're already targeting the politically attentive viewers who are already paying attention, right? It just gives them a different way, and maybe a more fun way of watching the news. Traditional soft news programs then would play the bigger role probably in terms of attention, because they're targeting less politically attentive viewers. Knowledge. Television allows individuals to learn passively, even if they're neither interested in a topic nor motivated to learn about it. This is possible because individuals are more likely to accept information presented in a non-conflictual manner. So rather than a debate between two different sides, if you just have kind of a political show, talking about politics, where they're presenting, say, one side, but it's not an active hostile debate, or they're just discussing an issue without it being kind of the back and forth that you would see kind of on more mainstream political shows. So people are, if it's just hearing about it, they don't necessarily care about it, but if part of the soft news show, if part of, the late show is talking about a political issue in between jokes about other things, even if the person doesn't particularly care about politics, they're listening to the show. And so some of the information is going to be coming in. There is some debate about how much learning occurs, but political learning effects appear strongest among individuals who are relatively uninterested in and hence unmotivated to learn about politics, right? So the people who already care about politics, they already have high degrees of knowledge about political issues. They don't need kind of the passive learning. They already have a probably deeper understanding of the issue. But passive learning, we are going to see much more on people who aren't caring, but they're still just listening to the show, and so they're picking up some things. Taken together, the findings suggest that at least some consumers do learn about politics via soft news, but what they are learning, how much, and how long-lasting remains subject to debate, right? So how much of this learning is happening, we don't know. What we can conclude is that some of it is happening, but almost everything else beyond the fact that some of it is happening is still subject to debate. All right, so what about changing of attitude? So if we've got people paying a little bit more attention and having a little bit more knowledge, is this shaping their attitudes, right? Just having knowledge doesn't necessarily mean that you've got an opinion on it. So can soft news shape attitudes? Some positive potential effects. Traditional soft news can make candidates appearing on the shows more likable, right? So by making them seem more likable, you can change their attitudes about a given politician and make them more likely to vote. So like I said, a politician, particularly one who has likability problems, can go on, appear much more likable, and shift attitudes. Also, for example, someone who doesn't have high knowledge or isn't that interested in politicians, if they come on the show, they seem really, really likable. The person may not even pay that much attention to the policy and just say, I really like that person. Maybe I'll support them. Satirical comedy shows can enhance critical thinking and thought complexity, right? So they're presenting usually a more challenging perspective on different politics. And so it can actually help get people who are watching the shows to think critically about issues. And when we're going to next week watch some segments of some of them, and some of them can actually present fairly insightful views of politics. And sometimes we will be bringing up issues that many of the mainstream sources aren't necessarily bringing up, and present them in a different way. And often, because of satire, challenging some things that you may have held, and then kind of showing the ridiculousness of them. And so it can actually help increase critical thinking and thought complexity. Negative effects. So traditional soft news can enhance support for isolationism and cynicism. So it can make people more cynical about politics. And this is particularly going to be the case for satirical comedy. Soft news can lower assessments of all candidates, increase cynicism about the political process and media, right? Because political satire shows will typically make fun of almost anybody and show the ridiculousness of so many different things. It can lead viewers to kind of think that the entire political process is a joke, right? And it doesn't really matter who you choose. They're going to be doing dumb things, whether you choose, liberal, conservatives, NDP, Bloc. If they're all going to be doing dumb things, saying dumb things, it doesn't really matter who you choose. And is the political, or is getting engaged in the political process really worthwhile? And finally, behavior. And behavior at the end of the day is probably, changes in behavior probably require changes in attention, knowledge, and attitudes. But behavior at the end of the day is the big one that we care about. All those other ones may need to change, but if all those other ones change and behavior doesn't change too, so you have updates even of attitudes, but more people don't show up to vote as a result of those changes in attitudes, then soft news isn't that useful politically, from at least kind of the perspective of political campaigns. And the big reason a politician usually comes on the show is to try to help them get more vote. If it's not going to swing any of the voting, then it doesn't really matter. So this is the main place that scholars will be looking. And so usually they're asking two questions. Are soft news consumers differently likely to vote than comparable non-consumers? So does watching soft news make you more likely to vote differently than kind of your counterparts who aren't politically engaged but who don't watch soft news? And are they likely to vote differently contingent on showing up at the polling station? So also does it affect kind of showing up, right? So say some would vote differently if they showed up, but they're not more likely to show up, it doesn't really matter. So negative effects. So there's kind of two different kind of arguments. So you've got the selective exposure argument. With entertainment options, non-political interested individuals could avoid hard news and are therefore less likely to vote. Conversely, very politically interested individuals can consume more news and more likely to vote. So, and even in this case, selective exposure, even if a soft news program, for example, is having, an interview with Justin Trudeau, if you hate Justin Trudeau, you've got the options that you could flip it off that day and say, I'll come back to the show another day, but I've got options. So if I don't care about politics, I don't have to see a humanized version of Justin Trudeau. I can just flip away. So even in terms of, you can have selective exposure, even when it comes to, soft news. And for example, the politically satire ones can, help people to, watch a political satire show that tends to be more ideologically congruent with them. They can watch more hard news and be more likely to vote, and so have more polarization. Positive effect. So political comedy shows increase attendance at campaign events and other political actions. So that's a positive effect, that watching these shows do help people to actually show up at campaign events. Traditional soft news viewers are more likely to cross party lines after seeing the candidate on TV. So in terms of helping to minimize polarization, and kind of listening to multiple perspectives, traditional soft news viewers are actually more likely to vote for a candidate from the other side, which, when we're talking about polarization, that's something that should very, very rarely be happening, but that's more likely to happen. And traditional soft news viewers are also more likely to vote for the candidate who best matches their interests compared to non-viewers. So in terms of knowledge gained, it does seem that the knowledge gained from watching even traditional soft news shows does help people to make more informed decisions about the candidate that fits their interests. So voting according actually to their interests. So in terms of decreasing polarization, having informed voting, traditional soft news shows seem to have a positive benefit, and your more satirical political comedy shows, for those who are politically engaged, actually help them to get more involved in the process. So not just things like voting, but also getting involved in campaign events and other political action. And so these are changes in kind of that we didn't have decades ago because, well, we didn't, for kind of the first part of the lecture, we didn't have social media. And we certainly have seen the rise of more media choices in political, in soft news. And so soft news has, to a certain extent, changed the political attention, knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. All right, so that's all for this time. Next time for the lecture, it'll be quite fun. We'll be watching segments of some of these soft news shows, particularly some of the political satire ones, which can be a lot of fun, just to kind of get an idea for those who aren't already watching them of kind of how it is that they're presenting the news, what is a political satire show, and kind of how can they, one of the things that was shown is that they can potentially increase cynicism. So you can see how could it increase cynicism, but also talked about how it can also make you look at political issues slightly differently. And so how can it do so? Right, so enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll talk to you next week.